Good afternoon, everyone. I extend a very warm welcome to everyone who has joined us today for this webinar on India's clean energy transition, a subject that has been a focus area for mongabay-india for several months now. This is the fifth episode in the series of webinars we are hosting on the challenges and opportunities that India's clean energy sector is facing. Today, we want to focus on who actually benefits from India's clean energy jobs. We want to understand what will India's clean energy transition mean for the new workforce joining the sector, or actually the old workforce involved in the fossil fuels driven energy sector. This is a critical question for a country like India because energy sector, the section driven by fossil fuels or by clean energy projects, directly and indirectly impacts livelihoods of millions of people involved. In fact, over the past few months, Mongabay India has done several stories on this subject. We have tried to explore the subject from the perspective of workers, governments, businesses, and consumers. In fact, we see reports every few months or weeks claiming how the clean energy sector will lead to millions of jobs. For instance, today itself, a new study by the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, National Resource Defense Council, and Skill Council for Green Jobs came out with a report which said the clean energy, renewable energy sector could potentially employ around 1 million people by 2030, which is next 9 years. 8-9 years, and which is basically 10 times more than the existing workforce in the sector right now. We have another report, I remember in November 2021 by the International Renewable Energy Agency and International Labour Organization, which said that India can actually create 3.5 million jobs, short and long term, as we pursue the 500 gigawatt target by 2030 from non-fossil fuel based energy. In fact, there's another report by the World Economic Forum which talked about 2050 target and something around 1 trillion of economic opportunity and 50 million jobs in another 30-40 years. So, the question that our readers ask us often this around jobs is who actually are the beneficiaries of these millions of jobs and how these opportunities going to play out when this clean energy transition happens. To take this discussion forward today, we have a stellar cast of experts who will help us in understanding whether there is enough change or enough charge for our clean energy sector and how these jobs will play out. We have Mandvi Singh, who is the program manager for energy and climate change at iForest, which is a think tank working on energy sector. She's an energy policy researcher with over 12 years of research and engagement experience. Her areas of work include renewable energy integration, clean energy access, promotion for productive use, emission reduction and phase out of coal power plants, climate mitigation, climate justice. In fact, she has several publications on these issues to her credit, and she is also an economist by education. We also have Mr. Ashim Roy, who is the founding general secretary of the New Trade Union Initiative. He has around 30 years of experience in the trade union movement and rich association with social, political, and human rights campaigns. He's also the founding member of many international organizations and networks. He has enrolled himself for years now with the Trade Union for Energy Democracy, a global coalition to shape the unique perspective on climate change, policy advocacy for fair and just transition, and energy democracy. Last but not the least, we also have Shweta Srinivasan, who is working as the Energy Program Manager at the India Climate Collaborative. She's a climate change researcher and sustainability professional with over 10 years of experience in the technology and policy aspects of energy and environment sectors. She has a keen interest in accelerating decisions for low carbon transition and has experience in using energy systems and systems modeling, systems thinking, multi-criteria analysis, cost benefit analysis, economic analysis. She has worked on several projects to inform low carbon policy at national and state levels. Before I start the discussion and invite the panelists to take the center stage, I would just like to clarify and set some basic information. We will request each panelist to take 5 to 7 minutes each to share their remarks, following which we'll have a short discussion on the issues raised by them, as well as those documented by Mongabay India during our series. After the discussion, we'll take questions from the audience. I encourage everyone who is joining us today on social media or on this call to share their comments either in the chat box or questions in the Q&A box. I would like to first invite Manvi, Ms. Singh, to share her perspective. Manvi, the stage is all yours.
Thank you, Mayank. Before I begin, just a word on iForest. This is a new organization set up 2 years ago, and we are working on some of the most pressing issues of environment and development. Clean energy transition is at the very center and at the very sort of core of our work profile, and on both aspects. One on sort of the exploring the possible pathways to increase RE penetration, and also on how to ensure a just transition away from coal. So as far as clean energy expansion and jobs are concerned, India has already witnessed quite an expansion in the impact of expanding RE on stimulating jobs has already been seen, and it has been across the value chain of pre-construction, construction, O&M, business development, etc. So this area which didn't exist 10 years ago has suddenly sort of boomeranged and expanded to an extent that we are talking about over 1 lakh jobs existing and 10 times increase, like now CEW has in today's report mentioned. And when you broaden the horizon of clean beyond renewable energy, then the number really expands. So then you have the numbers that the World Economic Forum is putting out of 50 million jobs and such. So even if one was not to get into the number per se, the exact number per se, the jump is expected to be manifold. It will be manifold, and this is not even accounting for the allied green areas of EVs and batteries and hydrogen and whatever T&D investment is going to get into supporting RE, or even the demand side management that has to be done to support RE, and just focusing on renewables and renewable generation. There are various segments of RE that hold vast potential, that need policy attention and support today to stimulate that multitude of direct, indirect, and sort of induced jobs. And there are two particular ones that I've sort of thought I'll focus on during this sort of address. And one is distributed renewable energy. I think DRE sector in India has grown in stature in recent times. It is an area where I've also sort of worked more in the recent past. So I've seen that transition which has evolved from basic lighting to really livelihood support for rural India. And I think it is important to talk about this sector because the employment generation potential of this segment remains untapped. And already there is a supply gap of adequately skilled and trained technicians to provide installation and maintenance services in those tier 3, tier 4, and even villages. So, and this existing gaps is both in terms of the number of technicians and also the quality of technicians available there. When I was at GIZ before coming to iForest, I did a survey of about 1,000 solar water pumps across India, which were installed 4-5 years back. And one of the key things that emerged out of that study was that the after-sales services that were being provided to these installations were really lacking, and simply because there was no infrastructure to support it. There were no technicians around to support it. So, as the penetration increases, this becomes really crucial. And even now currently we're working in Jharkhand very closely with at district level, and we see similar gaps. That Jalminar has been constructed out of solar, but it's not working. Nobody knows where to go and who to ask to fix it. So that's kind of an existing huge area of gap that can be tapped into to create employment at rural level, in an area which really requires attention. And the now providing DRE has impacts on both livelihoods and jobs at two levels. One is the direct job that I've talked about in terms of installation, monitoring, maintenance, services, etc. And what happens is that the sector still remains on the fringes a little bit. But in a net zero scenario where you're talking about increasing penetration of renewables, where it completely sort of offsets coal, the DRE will see a much larger role in urban and peri-urban areas, because solar expansion strategy that kind of blankets all of the country's wastelands, or most of it, is really not the sustainable path. So you really have to plan in a way where DRE, these distributed renewable energy generation points across consumption points or closer to the consumption points are given much more importance. So, so given this role that the segment can possibly play, and it is a much more labor intensive segment than compared to a utility scale, large scale solar installation. So there is a much wider, and also there's a much wider role of semi-skilled kind of labor, which is abundant or can be trained in rural kind of setups. So really a much larger opportunity for local youth of the villages or the smaller towns that can be tapped here. And the second aspect of DRE is that that is worth highlighting is that it itself is creating jobs. It itself is providing employment and enhancing livelihoods. I'll not delve too much into it, but it is sort of well understood that when you give a farmer a solar water pump, his income, it has a direct income impact. It has a direct impact on his output. Or when you put up a solar atta chakki through a self-help group of 5 women, it is giving jobs to those 5 women. Or a youth that was otherwise disguisedly unemployed is now running a solar-backed multi-grain processing unit somewhere in Jharkhand. So DRE has those direct kind of implications on employment, and also the one referring to technical skills, etc. So this is an area which needs much closer attention and will play a much larger role in the net zero conversation. And skilling infrastructure essentially is what one is pointing towards, and more attention to that. And the second potential area I'd perhaps quickly mention is about at the manufacturing end. I think this is an area where we missed out on so far, and is primarily the reason why, if you look at China, they've created much more jobs per megawatt of capacity than compared to India. And some studies call it 3 times. There was a recent news articles that put the number at 3 times. And there have been barriers in the past because of which we couldn't achieve that. But the government is clearly now focusing on it. There are multiple schemes out there, whether it is special incentive package and production linked incentives, or make in India and preferential procurement, etc. So all that is being done, and we really need a comprehensive kind of an industrial policy at this point, sort of that focuses on solar manufacturing, and in fact all of clean tech related technologies, to really unlock the job potential, the employment potential that could run into hundreds of millions of Indians being employed through these segments. So that's there, and it can potentially not just compensate for the job losses that happen in coal industry, but go much more beyond it. And on that note, just to sort of summarize what I've been talking about, I'll just make a quick comment on just transition here, because that's really where majority of iForest's research and engagement so far has been on. This energy transition conversation has wide implications for coal economy that currently exists in the country, and people talk about various timelines for coal phase out, but broadly, we can agree that it's in the next 2-3 decades. This coal extraction economy is going to drastically shrink, and if we do not make any kind of those concerted efforts towards addressing it through planning and skill development and really micro level planning, it could potentially create a lot of chaos and resistance, which could, if not derail, then delay your sort of climate ambitions. So I will speak more about it perhaps during the discussion phase, if given an opportunity. But I'll stop at this, that more policy level attention to these pockets that have huge potential, that need policy attention, and to sort of maximize their potential over the next decade and so. So over to you, Meg. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Singh, for your insight. In fact, it is very helpful. I have a couple of points that I would like to discuss with you once we go to the discussion stage. Now I will invite Mr. Roy to take the center stage. And just before I give him the mic, I just want to tell that he has been somebody who's working from decades over with unions and workers on the issue of energy and workers involved in the sector at the ground, on the ground level. Mr. Roy, the stage is all yours. Thank you so much.
You're on mute, sir.
You're on mute.
Thanks, Mike, for giving me this opportunity. My core intervention would be to really highlight the fact that it has been not easy actually to talk about fair transition. And so I would really focus on the fair transition part of it. I mean, I know there was a lot of debate, and there was a lot of debate when we as a union movement, which is actually reluctant to really address environmental and energy question. So we were one of the first people to create a group or a caucus to see that we both try to understand the implication of the climate change. And we were one of those few people who did not, when the climate science was just coming into being, that we decided we should really move forward to make the climate science into a larger, a larger absorption in the trade union movement. And that's what we did. But in that process, we also realized the two fundamental problems that the union movement or labor movement as a whole would face. One is that essentially, if you look at, and I'm going to restrict myself to the energy transition question. Essentially, if you look at energy transition, the energy transition will primarily be from the coal sector to a non-coal sector, to renewable energy sector. And coal sector, for whatever reason, historically has always primarily been in the public sector. It's unfortunate, it's a sector which has actually somehow always had a lot of problems and were taken over by public sector. The renewable energy is almost everywhere in the world is primarily also getting into the private sector. So essentially this transition is also going to mean that there's a shift from state sector or public sector to the private sector. And some of the implication of how those sectors are regulated and how those sectors are working will have a larger impact on the way the transition takes place and to the labor welfare in these two sectors. That's the first point. The second point is that when we come back to looking at the coal transition and when we have just said about how things are at the ground level, I just want to bring out one key factor first is that we do have to see the employment in those coal sector, which includes coal mining as well as in the thermal power station. But more than that, I think this is something that is being missed out mostly, is that in the end of the day, there's a coal, not only coal employment, there's a coal economy that many districts are dependent on. So when actually there's a coal transition, this is what is called the mining curse, which has historically happened again and again, that the districts where minings were the base of an economy, when they move away from those mining, suddenly everyone abandons them and it becomes ghost towns. It has no economy, it has lifeless things. Essentially, we need to also invest and plan out how those economies or the coal-based economy will make a transition. And this is something that I feel is not happening with adequateness, and the government doesn't have a policy. I think India would be one of those few countries, and to be fair to the Prime Minister, he has seen the opportunity of this so-called huge capital investment that can come in from shift from an old energy system to a new renewable energy system. And one expects a huge amount of capital investment. Because I don't want to go into figures. I'm sure most of the people who are listening to it understand that the scale of investment, this is almost going to be a fundamental shift in the investment pattern. When there's a crisis in investment, this could actually absorb a whole lot of capital investment that has not happened. But that, having said that, the point which I'm trying to stress is that there will be a transition. Unlike many other, I believe, and I've been arguing this for a long time, that the transition is not, there was a dip between whether the energy transition, whether basically into the renewable energy transition has slowed down. But I think as the crisis comes up in terms of investment strikes and investment crisis, the renewable energy will become one fundamental area where capital is going to get absorbed. What I fear is that the fair transition will not take place. So I'm absolutely sure the transition will take place. The fair transition will not take place. Let's give me an example. The coal cess that has been worked out and a huge amount of money has been now already been accumulated Not even one. I don't even know. I'm not kept up to date in the last 1 year. But essentially, the whole of the money has gone into investing in renewable energy. It hasn't got one of the iota of has gone into the fair transition. So the question is that the fair transition, whether it's a thermal power station workers who are going to get reskilled, skilling is not going to be so easy. There are lots of technological issues that has to be worked out. But more than anything else, I'm really worried that not even rehabilitation of a set of let's say, a section of the coal workers. And I'll come to the last point of how the absorption, how the rehabilitation is being envisaged. But essentially, the whole coal economy that actually in many parts in India, particularly Jharkhand, where more than I think 18 districts are part of built on this basis, they will going to get all denuded in terms of any investment and any redevelopment until there is a constant effort to re-envisage the idea that just transition requires building of this local area economy. Now that gives us a different kind of opportunity of how you make an employment-intensive economy there. All these are new questions which can be answered. That's the third and the last point which I want to say is that when you talk about really transition, I'm going to stick first on the first round to the fair transition question, then come down to the question of real, renewable energy employment question later on. But in this transition, let us look at the structure of the workforce. The structure of the workforce is that in the thermal power station and in the coal sector, it will be much more larger. Basically, 40% of the whole of employment is in the informality in the formal sector. That means they are basically unsecured jobs. Now, and this is exactly what will be the cost that has never been taken into consideration. When you look into the cost of transition, people will start looking at regular workers, looking at how the unions can come and negotiate that regular workers who's already permanent and may in any way will get a rehabilitation of some kind, or at least will get some compensation of some kind. But 40%, and this increases to 60% in the coal India and the coal sector, this is a large chunk of people who constitute actually the backbone of the local area economy. And they are actually already in informality, they're already in insecure jobs. And when that transition happens, they will, on all probability, until there's a social movement on the ground level and policy initiative to really cater to them, they will be left out. So I see a very fast transition, but I see a very bleak, fair transition. And I'll end with that point and discuss the other questions as we have in the next round. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. Thank you so much for your unique perspective. I think this sets the stage for our discussion later on. In fact, some of our stories have dwelled on this, and my colleagues are posting the links of those stories. I'll request the attendees to have a look, those in the audience. Now, last but not least, I'll invite Ms. Srinivasan, who is a brilliant researcher, to share her remarks, and so that we can take the discussion forward. All yours.
Thank you, Mayank, and thank you to Mongabay for inviting us on this panel. I don't think I have the type of credentials that Mr. Roy has or Manvi in specific in implementing projects, but I do want to share the perspective from India Climate Collaborative's perspective, which is basically an organization set up actually just 2 years ago, incubated under the Tata Trust's sustainability vertical. And the work that ICC hopes to bring to the Indian context is a collaborative ecosystem where you have domestic philanthropy working across climate change action. And also, we've identified the need for collaborative ecosystem building. So that's actually the role that we hope to play in India going forward. Now, coming back to the original question that you had posed, which was who benefits from the clean energy jobs, and you cited several estimates. I think who benefits will be anyone who was looking at the growth story in clean energy. Right. So, for example, unlike a lot of other countries, India's energy demands have not saturated. So if the clean energy transition is able to kind of open up and accelerate the growth of the clean energy industry at large, people engaged in the solar sector are definitely going to be beneficiaries. But the people who get left behind, as Mr. Roy also alluded in that conversation, also need to be brought into the fold. Because what we need to understand about these clean job numbers, and there are lots of ways in which you can estimate these clean job numbers. You can do it by looking at direct, indirect jobs, induced jobs, jobs which are in allied sectors, in the value chain or the supply chain of these sectors. But what is critical is not to focus as much on the numbers as much as where these jobs are coming and how these jobs are coming, right? And I think those two elements basically speak to both some of what Manvi and Mr. Roy were saying. So I think for the where part of it, I think what we need to be aware of is a lot of the way the planning is going on for the clean energy sector will of course be where the resource availability is there. And the way the national government's priority has been is to look at centralized large projects. However, decentralized rural applications and rooftop solar has potential for creating energy based jobs and servicing jobs, and also as a consequence the skilling requirements for those. But what we need to be wary about is those jobs will be concentrated in urban or states and regions which are RE rich. Where it may not get concentrated on is traditionally, there are pockets in India which have kind of escaped the development agenda, which unfortunately have also been these regions which are resource rich. So coal and mineral rich regions have historically poor developmental indicators. So the need is to necessarily identify and co-create job opportunities in those regions by riding the clean energy wave. So what we hope to do is try to make sure that at least from the point of view of Indian philanthropy and an ecosystem enabler, what we hope to do is induce some thinking in that fashion, which is a more system-wide thinking approach in the planning process itself. So try to ensure that if you have a particular region which has a likely, say a legacy mine closure on the anvil, then try to ensure that the process of identifying livelihood opportunities in those pockets are informed by the potential of a clean energy transition, or even an alternative developmental pathway, which may not have been something that has been thought of. And in order to do that, both ground up, there needs to be a sensitizing and socializing of the message. You cannot just go to a region and say that, sorry, your coal mine is closing and hence there will be no jobs for you. The idea is to make them a part of the planning and setting of the developmental agenda. So in order to do that, ICC sees a very critical role in trying to increase a lot of research and evidence generation capacity at the local level, create regional roadmaps, and we also hope to be able to support some critical elements of pilots that can be scaled up, whether those are DRE based solutions, whether and of course it should be informed by the local context, or even trying to identify how financing can be mobilized in a big way in this sector. A key component of ICC's role in the ecosystem is to try to mobilize more finance for climate action, but ensuring that that finance is mobilized in a fashion in which social and developmental indicators are prioritized in the planning process becomes a big critical component. So, there has been a lot of momentum post COP26 in which there's a lot of talk of a just transition fund and climate investment fund, which has been targeting just transitions programs across several countries, whether it's South Africa, Indonesia, India, all historically coal-based economies. But the idea is, if those small amounts of finance do come, how do you spend it? There's no understanding of how to spend that finance, what qualifies as just. And right now, the research community has just scratched the surface because it's a very context specific issue. India is like a huge continent in itself. These conversations need to be broken down, I think, to the regional level in order for them to even make sense for, framing an actionable roadmap. So yeah, those would just be my introductory comments, and I'm happy to engage further.
Thank you, Mr. Srinivasan, for your remarks. In fact, very crucial points. In fact, all the three panelists, their remarks will help us in segueing to the discussion forward. Whether we talk about, say, fair transition, whether we talk about the region specific, how fast the transition is happening, or whether we talk about the policy level interventions, as Manvi said, all are very, very, very important, because if you look at this sector, millions of people directly or indirectly involved. Okay. Now that we are going into the second phase of our program today, I'll just like to start with a very simple basic thing. That there has been, this intense debate, as you also, all three of you mentioned in your remarks. So do you think that the workers who benefit from clean energy jobs are the ones who are involved in the fossil fuel sectors, or we have a complete different set of people? Because when we look at our stories are giving us a mixed result, mixed impact. There is definitely a separate section of people involved, but there is also a possibility of transitioning people involved in fossil fuel energy sector to the clean energy sector. I'll first like to start with Manvi. Manvi, if you can take this, and then anybody else who wants to take a stab at it.
So your question is that if this potential is this traditionally thermal related people can go into RE, or are they going already? So definitely there's this mix that you've talked about will come out if you look at the numbers, but theoretically it's not necessary. For instance, I was looking at Germany, and one of their coal dominant cities, coal producing cities, their just transition plan is completely focused on tourism. Okay, so it's not that, you have to go from coal to solar. But if you look perhaps in India's context, there is a potential, partly because there are two reasons for it. One is land. There is a lot of land which has been already destroyed by open cast mining, which can potentially be your source of, which can potentially be utilized for solar power generation. And there's a lot of such land available in Jharkhand or Chhattisgarh or Odisha. But then the land laws need to be sort of maybe reformed. I don't know if reform is actually possible, but something has to be done around, the ownership, related issues, or leasing related issues. So yeah, so there is a lot of land which can be tapped into there. The second thing is solar generation. There are allied sectors where those investments can come in, like I mentioned, whether it is manufacturing or other things. It is really a planning is needed, because you don't want to leave these people in a limbo. Like Mr. Roy mentioned, it is a very, very strong possibility. If you go to Dhanbad, there is nothing other than coal for them. Even the shopkeeper is coal dependent, because that's, like he said, it's a coal economy that we're talking about. So the planning that can be done, and the planning sort of capability, that gap is there, but funding gap is in my opinion is not the biggest challenge, because he talked about coal energy, the coal cess, but the coal cess is actually being used for GST and not for renewables. It's just taken up for something else. But then there's another pool of money that these districts are sitting on, which is DMF, which is again being utilized in the most haphazard manner and can be structured to actually benefit a restructuring of these economies. bit by bit. You do not have to shut down coal mines tomorrow. You have a head start to plan and think about that future. So potentially, yes, these economies can start thinking about, Dhanbad can start thinking about rebranding itself as a solar city. You can start with a small skilling unit and build from there. So yeah, theoretically, there's no restriction, but you have to plan for it and work towards it.
Mr.
Over
Roy,
to you,
would you like
Mayank.
to come in?
Yeah, please. Thank you, Manvi. Shweta, do you want to go for it?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty good question, and I think my opening remarks on the regional perspectives speak to it. The only thing that I'd like to add is this element of skilling, right? Like if you look at the regions and the type of labor involved, it's largely contract. I mean, you have to look at whether they're contractual or informal workers, and informal workers may not have access to skilling. The other aspect I'd like to bring in here is the gender aspect. When you talk about women in mines, I mean, the millions of photos available online to understand that, right? But when you look at the jobs that are available in clean energy, they are unfortunately oriented towards like male dominated, security or cleaning jobs, etc. There is that perspective, and I think those elements need to be worked out as this transition is planned for those regions as well. I can give you an example that when land has been in cases where agrarian land has been kind of appropriated for large RE projects, there has been a situation in, for example, Karnataka, where the women have kind of the only options or economic options available for them has been like to set up a tea stall, right? In that setup. So the technical capacity also for these, the technical skill planning and making sure there's an inclusion from the gender perspective is quite critical.
Mr. Roy, you were, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to add here that one is that I do agree that this requires a far more research to understand the complexity of this transition. And that is what I feel is one of the things that there's a massive gap. And I look forward to ICC's work on this area. It'll be fascinating for us. I do think, I mean, regional economy, if I understand, I use the word local area economy, so I'm assuming it's the same frame. So I do agree that one of the most important grid on which this transition has to be framed up, and that's not at all being done. It's done at too macro level to understand the exact transition. Transition is very concrete transition. There are a set of people who want to get lose out and a set of people who want to get in. So unless there's a very like a macro level at a level of local area economy, this transition is worked out. I feel that somehow that I am not really. I'm sure maybe I missed in the research world what's happening, but essentially the amount of knowledge that should go in and shaping this up and shaping the planning exercise is not really happening. There's a lot of discursive level that something is happening, which I'm also part of it, and I keep on saying, but actual transition question and how to really do it is something only now that actually people are getting, and I'm looking forward to seeing this. That's making a first point. The second point is I do agree there's a theoretical possibility. There's a theoretical possibility of making the whole of the coal area into some kind of, I mean, people have to conceptualize. It could be, it could be agro fisheries project, or it could be actually a rebuilding of the solar energy using the whole coal mining area base as a thing. Now, but the fact is that the people in doing that, you require a far more, let's say, people who are investing don't want to wait for such a long time for investment. Now, this is where the question is: will the private sector invest into waiting for the transition in Jharkhand to do? I'm sure his payback period, his concept of what is this kind of internal rate of return, all this conceptual framework will not work out for him. So he will go out and look in Rajasthan, like Reliance is doing, we'll look into asking government, give us a whole land, we'll just build it up. So this is how actual transition will take place. So I do see the possibility of theoretical transition of that kind. Now, that is required a dedicated public sector or government organization or a certain special vehicle, whatever you want to call it, which actually takes the responsibility of making that transition happen. Now, until that is policy induced, I'm not very sure that the market created. And that's my concern, and that's one of the issues that happened. Same thing, like there was an idea when mine closure was going to take place that we're going to invest into making mines into water bodies, fisheries, and things. If you go back to the analysis of what people have done on this, there's hardly any such conversions taking place, except for, I think, one which was done by the public sector in Singareni. I don't think any other area that was actually an example of doing it. So the history of this is something that doesn't give one confidence, but that shouldn't mean that we should not work towards it. I give an example of the renewable energy. One of the, there was an earlier phase. I was a much more younger person then. In 80s and 70s, there was a phase of what we used to call the biogas. We had a huge investment in what is called, biogas. When people talked at that time, people thought it was something which I was involved in as a young person who actually built up biogas and building up the policy, wrote the first manual of it, in fact, in some sense. One of the biggest problems of the biogas program was that there was no servicing, as you rightly said, just there was no servicing. Similar thing was going to happen with the renewable energy decentralized solar panel. You will have people will get the initial investment, but people will not be, until there is actually an adequate public sector system that is totally focused and geared up to it. Or at least there's a joint venture where actually the state and the public sector is involved in pushing for a certain policy thing. That's my core concern. Without that, I am very doubtful, and this is my concern, that the market will be able to make this transition in the way one talks about fairness. So that's why the policy inducement has to happen. And the policy inducement cannot happen if there are no institutions which really absorb those policy energies into it and take up the idea of translating those policy to actually execute them on the ground at some level. So these are some concerns that I have of the kind of transition, whether it will have the same set of people or not. The other one last point is that particularly in thermal power station, it is possible to do that actually. Thermal power station transition can be much well thought out, much better than possibly in the coal transition, because coal transition, majority of the workers would be unskilled or semi-skilled, and they would require a different kind of whole treatment of skilling. Let's take an example, which again going back to history. We are going through what is called a massive infrastructure development. But is it really making a shift in the skilling level of our workforce? All data shows no. So we are going through a historical transition of what is called investment in big housing project, big bridge making. And if you were to go back, has it created a stable base of construction workers who can move from job to job at a higher levels of wages? No. So I'm worried about those things, and those are my concerns. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. In fact, all three of you have touched upon points that I'm going to raise in my following questions. I'll come one by one. For example, over the last 2 years, we have done several stories which talked about the region-specific issues, the gender-specific issues, wages, and how these things are playing out. Okay, for instance, if you look at the whole region-wise, how the energy is playing out, you have seen the whole renewable energy development on the western and the southern part, while the whole eastern and the central part is where the fossil fuel driven energy sector is based. In that scenario, when this development happens, when the renewable energy, clean energy jobs comes, they all are majorly concentrated in the western part of the country, western or the southern part of the country. What happens to this whole area, the central and eastern area, and the jobs or the workforce involved in this area? Because primarily this area or this belt is also the belt, also the area where, as Shweta was pointing out, where the development indicators or the social indicators are not very high or not very promising. And then if we also take the work or the jobs, how will this transition, how will these clean energy jobs transition impact the workforce already involved in energy sector? And how will it impact, this paradox between the east south and the central eastern? How will, like, west south and central eastern, how will it play out? Because this is very fascinating, because this is happening. It's not that something is not happening. We have states, like rich states like on the western coast, how transition and how a lot of projects are happening on that side. And then the jobs may go in decades to come, a couple of decades. And as we say that, as every one of you pointed out, coal energy says, we have DMF, we have afforestation work, but none of that money actually reaches the people who are impacted by that, and how that money is appropriated. So Shweta, I'll come to you for this first. How do you see this paradox from the region perspective, and how do you see this playing out in terms of the workforce, and how what this transition means for the workforce involved in both the sectors, and as far as regions are concerned?
Right. Thanks, Mayank. I think from the regional perspective, there are a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. And these are points that I'm borrowing from my fellow panelists, that when you talk about the growth in clean energy jobs, it's largely being private sector led, as opposed to 20, 30 years ago, where you had CIL as well as NTPC and all government plants, state and central, being set up in these pockets that you're talking about, where the transition is likely to happen. So there will be a different, while there is that paradox, there is a different perspective also, because you can't rely necessarily on the state to plan this out. And that's my perspective, that while it will be critical to have policy signals coming out and incentivizing and supporting such structures, the states that are vulnerable or the regions that are vulnerable will really have to work within the ambit of market, civil society, private sector working together in order to enable those transition plans. So as an example, if you look at regions in Jharkhand or Chhattisgarh, which is a mine heavy, resource rich space, they may not have the capacity, like local administration. There is a governance deficit there, right? So you're going to have to ensure that, like, even tomorrow, if the government says that no, you have to come up with a livelihood diversification policy for that region for the next 5 years, they don't have the capacity right now to be able to implement that. So I think that perspective is going to be critical in shaping that. Whereas these are also regions where you have potentially strong civil society, NGO organizations, the DMF funds that Manvi also mentioned. There are lots of, DMFs had come up to support institutions, local institutions that can do some of the work that government service provisioning was supposed to do, right? So when we talk about the worker perspective in these regions, I see two aspects playing out. One is, if you need the civil society and private sector involved, the modes of engagement will be different. And that will, of course, have to be studied. The second is, if you're also talking about the kind of sectors that will get affected. You mentioned coal mines, etc. Coal mining is predominantly the only one where I see a major vulnerability playing out. Coal, maybe oil, gas, but the other sectors for, say, which are affected by the clean energy transition, which include the automobile sector, and IJTC and iForest have done some mapping of that. A large number of those are across India, are pan-India, in terms of the allied sector. So, for example, if you're talking about allied sectors such as railways, it's, the entire coal logistics, port logistics, handling. If you map all of that out, it's infrastructure that can kind of be circumvented to a clean energy transition, if you know what I mean. So the skilling level may be the same. And I think it's important to keep the regional perspective sectorally relevant when you're doing this planning. So it's not necessary that that region will not be able to cope and people won't be able to move if there are the correct entities engaged.
Thank you.
Sorry,
Ms.
that was too abstract. Yeah.
No, it works. Mr. Roy, the next question I want to come to you, and this basically, I would request you to dip into your experience of dealing with people involved, the workers involved in the unions, with the unions. So, when we see a lot of people involved in the energy sector, in the fossil fuels based energy projects, we see a lot of, as you pointed out, public sector units, unlike compared to the private ones. And we see a lot of people with working with unions, a very strong union to ensure the rights of the workers involved, whether it is health, whether it is pension, everything. But that may not be the case for the workforce in the energy sector. That is the first part. And as you said, this transition will be fast, may not be fair. So that first part where they may not be able to have unions is something that we have also got a feeling from our stories. While we were talking to businesses, they were not very keen on the people involved to form unions. And once you know that these millions of people who are expected to come into the clean energy, they may not have unions, so they may not have a collective voice to get their voice heard about their rights. That is first part. But once, if you look at this, so how do you see that? The first part is, how do you see this absence of union or hesitancy around unions, or a mechanism to ensure the rights of the people involved in the clean energy sector? That is the first part that I wanted to ask you. And also, if you see the people who are involved, do you think that they're ready to even look at the clean energy transition, or their rights, as far as their rights are concerned?
Let me be first introspective about and look at our own union movement. I feel that we are totally inadequately prepared to address to this issue. Let me make my first self, what I would say as a reflection about our own sector first, which is one, true. But that doesn't mean that there is no knowledge within this sector or within my trade movement to be able to play a role. I just want to make first one general point. There's a general impression of the society, and this is a question of value of a society, that a unionism is basically a disruptor, which need not be the case. Actually, if you want to make an orderly transition, the unions are the best method. And the public sector private sector actually has learned it much more better. I always give this example that we have already made a transition in the industry. If you look at the private sector, there's already a transition. And the transition did not happen in absence of a union. Most of the time, the transition happened is actually in collaboration with the union. So you have to also take a bit of an experience and wisdom that the orderly transition nowhere in the world has happened without actually unions being involved. To give an example of the rule, which we just said earlier, I've been to that area and I have seen how why they took a decision to just go on to the side of making it into a tourist sector. It's very interesting. The world of mining history and mining knowledge is actually displayed in a way that it becomes a tourist spot. So what I'm trying to say that was done by a very elaborate process of how actually mining workers, mining engineers could be actually brought into this process of designing a new kind of framework for the rural area and areas where we could make that transition. I mean, there are many factors why that could be done there, and it not be so easy to be doing it in India. That's one. So that's one core factor. I do agree that there has to be a collaborative framework. There's no doubt about that. But in doing that, you do have to actually look into not just purely the organized sector union, which I would again say are in a very myopic in many. That's why I feel that if you were to go back to an organized trade movement in the coal India sector, you might land up actually worker getting compensation, which I'm sure we will be able to do it. I'm not at all worried. But if you go to the next two problem that the transition happens, will the informal sector be able to rehabilitate themselves? I'm not very sure the unions will be involved until there's a public body, until there is a research collaboration of a kind where civil society is a part of it, women's movement are a part of it, indigenous people's movement are part of it, which really come to a frame that this is something we all want and is in benefit for it. Otherwise, that will get left out. Then the second layer, as I think we have been sharing this again and again, that if you want to understand the economy of that area, not just the informal workers and how they will get rehabilitated or their transition happen, but how will the economy come to them? That is really a local level planning exercise, and that you can never do I would say just with the unions, but I believe that unions can play a very important role, because in some way, this sector has a lot of relationship with the whole people in that area in different ways. Now, whether we want to tap it or not tap it is a question that, state, the policy and everything, the body, the government and the policy making body has to do it. Let me just end with one example. Let's take an example. Like there's been a total, in a way, we have to also give this signal. And like Shweta, you said, some policy signals have to be given. The policy signal that this transition is going to have a different impact in West and South, and is going to have a different impact, has to be by a taxation policy. Someone has to pay for it. And I think that signal has to come in. Otherwise, the people will not see this. This is exactly what happened. We want an environment, but the people who are going to grow the forest, they will lose out in development in some fashion. So we will pay for that. This is there's a well-argued theory of this, there's well-argued policy options inside it. But somehow in the public discourse, that policy doesn't come into picture. So in a federal country, in a federal system, there is going to be states which are going to lose out. So I'm going to say that if one of the fair transition is like that there has to be some taxation which actually for the people in the South and people in the West who are going to get benefit out of it has to somehow pay for the transition, fair transition in the West. I don't know how, I'm not an expert on that, but I'm sure one can work out like that. And that is exactly why the poll says this example is a good example. Why does it fail? Why did it not go to the fair transition? The question that this comes to me are one, and this is the argument that actually people have been arguing. CPR, Center for Policy Research, has been arguing on this. The UK, that we need a legal mechanism. There has to be a frame in which the first way of doing a transition is to a consensus building. And the society has come to a consensus, but this is a fair transition, it's a law, this is the framework which we want to make a transition. That is when the fair transition will come up. Fair transition will not come up only by some scientists talking about it. Fair transition will not come out when just state decides that I will do it. Not at all. It will not come out. It's too big. It's a societal question. So it will not come out without civil society and other actors of the society coming in. How do you bring them all together? It cannot be done unless you really create a mechanism by which people come to consensus building and understand what a law should be, what should be the institutional mechanism for that fair transition. And that will not happen until the parliament is involved into this process, because that's when it gets into politics. And without getting into politics, the people will not respond to it. So I'm just making a very broad point about those problems that we are facing in the transition.
No, I really like it the way you are connecting all, because ultimately it ends up becoming a vicious cycle. One thing leads to another, and when there is no action on the other point, we come back to the same problem over and over again. In fact, this takes me to the question that we have been talking about: laws, mechanisms, framework, everything. And then we talk about the clean energy cess, then we talk about DMF, and then we talk about the compensatory afforestation fund being used, like when the forests are diverted for coal. So Manvi, I'll come to you now for this question, because in this country, we have hundreds of laws, hundreds of office memorandums, and thousands of orders and everything. But when it comes to implementation of these points, or when it comes to implementation of those policies, we end up either feeling as if those laws are not there anymore. Those policies everyone forgets. And as we have been repeatedly pointing out during, like everyone has said, that clean energy cess, which came out on clean energy projects, or for that matter DMF, has never actually gone or been used for the benefit of the people who it was intended for. In such a scenario, no matter how many, and recently we also did a story at Mongabay, which talked about that we are seeking 7,500 crore rupees from World Bank for a just transition, clean energy transition framework. So how do you see this, these plethora of laws, these mechanisms? Do you think that even they play out in the way that we expect them to be?
Yeah, Meg, that's a very good point. And I think both Shweta and Mr. Roy have kind of talked about this a little bit, but it really boils down to building capacity at local level. It's really a question of that. It's not the finance which will become an issue. It will come from World Bank, it will come from DMF, it will come from wherever. but building capacity to plan and execute, and truly giving them ownership. I think that's the key to it. That, you know, if again, I keep giving Dhanbad's example, but then if you have to rebuild Dhanbad, then you have to own Dhanbad. There has to be a sense of ownership in towards that rebuilding. And unless all of these stakeholders that Mr. Roy was talking about, unless all of them are brought on a kind of a platform, and you create that platform through some sort of those memorandums and kind of things that you talked about, they will not have the power to act. And unless they are empowered to and then given ownership, those two results will not come out. I was just thinking about this question of disparity that you talked about between Gujarat and Jharkhand when it comes to solar. Nobody stopped Jharkhand from doing that. Okay, so part of it was institutionally, the way RE potential is calculated in this country. There's a formula, and that kind of gives signals to people where to go. And maybe Gujarat has definitely Gujarat has more potential, but it's not like Jharkhand could not have done more. There was, you know, it's sad, but there's a lack of proactiveness to work towards it at an institutional level, at individual, and even at individual level. It's all part of that that culture that you can kind of become part of. So you have to shake all that. So this challenge of rebuilding these 3, 4, 5 states becomes even more challenging, because the institutional structures that are currently existing is just, it has to be shaken and woken up to take up something which is a massive and a ridiculous task. Now, the degree of effort might vary slightly from district to district, because the context will change. You know, there are districts where there is massive informal economy, and then massive shadow economy that is coal dependent, that is again going to sort of pull your leg and kind of make it more difficult for you to move away. And then there are districts that are more mechanized in their approach of mining. For instance, Korba. We are doing a study in Korba right now, which is looking at the socioeconomic dependence on coal, both for mining and for thermal power generation. And you'll be surprised by the kind of numbers that are coming up in terms of the dependence on coal, and also on people's willingness to move away from it. Nobody's married to coal in those districts. They're okay with if something else comes up and gives them employment. So my point is that all that becomes operational and works out only if something else, you know, is created, and that cannot be created without collaboration. So that becomes quite important. There was another point I was thinking of, but I'll come back to it. But yeah, I hope I've answered your question.
So Manvi, honestly, it makes sense, but you know, at the same time, during our conversations, my colleague Kundan, and there are a lot of people in my team and contributors who wrote. I agree with to some degree about your point, but you know, as different commentators point out, there are a lot of ifs and buts involved when it comes to states being proactive. Though it makes sense, but on the ground level, on the federal level, there are a lot of ifs and buts get involved. Mr. Roy, you want to take a stab at it at this?
I just want to add. Sorry, go ahead.
Just a small point that I wanted to make that I sort of was missing out on was that you know, iForest has been invited twice recently by various parliamentary sessions for a briefing on just transition. And I just wanted to, you know, make this point out there, because we're talking about these institutions supporting it, and I think it's a small step towards you know, making MLAs familiar with this issue, because you know, there is of course there is some degree of realization that coal is going away, but it has to be sort of clarified, and it has to be shown with numbers and facts that, you know, this is happening, and we have to think of an alternative, because this is, you know, politically will become a very sensitive issue going forward. So, and the kind of responses that local politicians, particularly like at an MLA level, give to it is pretty encouraging. Of course, it remains to be seen how it plays out going forward, and how that momentum is built and translated into action. But yeah, so the conversation needs to begin there also for the institutions on the ground to then sort of reflect
very
it.
crucial. In fact, what you have been talking about, capacity building and on institutions working, whether like on the ground level or on the policy level or on the institutional level, absolutely critical, very crucial. Mr. Roy, you were saying something?
Yeah, I was just saying that one is that I do agree that even as I said, in 2015, if I were to talk in the union, there was a division in the union because the energy sector union said, "Oh, this is all bunk. We're never going to change. So, and we'll require energy, things like that." And it was the Trade Movement for Energy Democracy as the international coalition really fought and convinced, and within the trade movement, that in the end, the Paris Convention actually allowed the word just for the first time in the whole declaration. So the point is that this is a process. I agree to that. Now, all laws have, like in various process of in India, particularly laws are so many that you feel like a law is somewhere else and the world is somewhere else. But I think in the last 2 decades, the one contribution that the social movement, the civil society movement has done is that lawmaking has not just remained within the portals of the parliament. If you look at Narega, if you look at right to food to workers, what I'm trying to say is that it actually builds up a lawmaking process can be a society consensus building process also. So I am looking at not law that the government decide one day how a fair transition should be there, and they just decide that this will be a law. I'm talking about how do you really bring up, and this is where all of us have to contribute to that. How do you build up a collaborative mechanism by which actually all the elements of the transition are somehow put into a debate in some way. And one of the best way of putting it is in terms of how a law will allow for this transition, which is the institution that will be created, or how the institution will look at it. How will individuals be facing this transition? And if they lose out from some policy, do they have a justifiable method of getting it all? All these are serious questions. Then only a fair transition can actually become a reality. It should not be just dependent on just agency. That's my point. It is something that it also should be a mechanism by which individual organization and civil sector and civil society actors can play out its own role in relation to the larger framework. So I feel that the process of a law which gives the legal foundation, the policy institutions and the policy framework, and again, the implementation agencies, these are all one part of a framework where we all have to really kind of converge. And that kind of debate has to still, and I'm really looking forward to both of you, Shweta and from Five Forests, to understand a bit more deeper and see what can be a broader collaborative mechanism by which the civil society organizations can do it.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. Thank you so much. I also wanted to know, okay, let's take the world is a very rosy place. It's a very good place. All the laws are being followed. All the mechanisms are being done. All the skill development programs are happening. But even in that case, for example, I'll tell you, I recently read one parliament report. It says of the 50,000 Surya Mitras that were trained by the government of India, only 40%, around 18,000 or 17 or 18,000 got employment. And even those 18,000, the employment status was not great. Just an example, just an anecdote. But I'm saying when we look at these skill programs, when we look at these capacity development programs, do you think when we're talking about institutional things, capacity development, do you think that we have the systems in place, or we have enough attention for the reskilling of the people involved, or skilling a new workforce for the clean energy transition, and ensuring that beyond skilling, that skill is not just a piece of paper, a certificate that somebody gets, like you are a Surya Mitra, or for example anything else, that actually those trainings or those things translate into work for them. Any of you, Manvi, Shweta, Mr. Roy?
Although I haven't been a part of any skilling initiatives, may I share my opinion on that question?
Please go ahead.
I think this issue of Surya Mitras not having enough work was an issue of putting the cart in front of the horse instead of the horse in front of the cart in this particular situation. Mostly because I think the policy signals were coming in with less long-term certainty for industry to act on, right? So I think that there are a few things that have happened in the last many months, which will definitely put things into action in terms of the right kind of policy signals coming from the government for RE or clean energy. which includes the net zero target that's come, knowing that, net zero basically means that at some point, okay, if not now, but at some point, the coal mine will have to close down or reduce action.
Yeah.
6 months ago, nobody was willing to talk about that. And I think that particular aspect of doing the skilling initiative in a fashion where there is a job for that person to get absorbed in is a part of the broader economic situation that India is in. We are a country in which right now we have, I mean, there have been reports on the demographic dividend getting missed, etc. We've also seen this issue of having a slowdown overall in the economy. And there is a talk of green recovery now. So with all this broader context, I think we need to make sure that any road mapping or plan for livelihood diversification, either at the regional level, state level, subnational or national level, does not just talk about skilling, or does not just talk about finance, or does not just talk about the asset being set up. So for example, an RE target. I think it needs to be cross-cutting, because without one, the entire setup fails. And historically, the plans that have worked have tried to tie all of them together, right? So you need to be able to make sure that you have that entire ecosystem ready to be able to act. And I think it was the 2019 economic survey which actually alluded to this aspect, the need to tie all of it together, because you can't go around doing that. Unfortunately, there has been a situation not just in clean energy jobs, but for example, energy efficiency auditors, etc. We've had this issue of certification, those auditors not having jobs because there isn't a energy service company available for them to join, which will do the audit, right? So, and those people actually end up doing some other, maybe IT job. That's been a situation of several of these skilling initiatives. So I think it's a question of that holistic planning happening. And I think a past is done. I think we really need to put aside because this is what they call the decade of action. And we've been calling every decade a decade of action. So we should probably really try to act either in these microcosms or at the national policy, and keep pushing wherever it moves. I think there's a need for that optimism that people are interested in their welfare. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
I've been involved with I'm a unionist in the end of the day, and I kind of in the manufacturing sector. So I'm actually involved in the negotiating the skilling of the workers in so many ways. One thing I want to say that in this one has to give credit that the private sector has a far more better, deeper understanding of the training needs than even the government. And the government puts money, but doesn't really fully understand the training needs. And I think the problem is that, again, here, after all, let me give you an example. The training is in the last mile issue. You cannot train a person who's actually doesn't have a framework for, even a basic knowledge. I'll give you an example. I was as an activist, not as actually working on a program. I tried to train what is called the services work technicians when I was, as I said, in the biogas program. The people who are really cleaning, who are taking care of the biogas, didn't even know what a biogas was. If I were to ask them, they did not know, because no one taught them. No one taught them even the rudimentary science that was required for them to understand what a biogas is. So our problem is that our skilling level comes up as if you just need a tool to understand this. It doesn't at all give any sense. Even today, you can be, I don't know whether you are aware of this. It's now becoming slightly changed. Otherwise, you would go to any house construction. You go to a corner of a house, you'll never see the right angle. That is one of the reasons why you do not have parts which fit into the houses. You cannot have a prefabric windows and doors, because they will not fit into your house. Because the people who make it can't measure. They will make 2 millimeter difference because you did not train them to the tolerance level. This is the reality. What I'm trying to say, that the training has to be framed up, and these are all practical. I'm just saying, in every sector I'm involved in, I feel that there's a gap, and the gap is so deep that I'm sometimes like, I feel very pessimistic about it, because I do feel that it is possible. Our people are really very skillful. I'm a union organizer and a leader in one of the biggest engineering firm in India. I don't want to name the thing. We do like almost like almost like 10 mm and 20 mm cladding of welding. That's the kind of skill very few country has this. And this has been trained from people who are absolutely without who did only what is called roadside skilling. But they learned through it. The industry invested inside it. They went through a rigorous methods of doing it and doing it. So I feel it is the government feel that you give a program, you give money. I am amazed the amount of the money that is wasted on the skilling project in India. I don't
finance is not an issue. Certainly,
finance is not an issue. It is actually the reality is that even today, and this is where the problem is, that no one is really invested into the training as it should be. People are looking at it still as a business opportunity, and so then, like everything else, it's just a question of how much you can cut it out. And this cannot be done. No country has. If you go back to China, you look at the amount of investment they've done on the training of their people. Even you go back to US or any other where the unions have been involved in the skilling program from the very beginning. Every union has a skilling department, because they actually have a joint collaboration to see that the worker gets skilled. Skilling is negotiated within the agreement. Now, if I were to say, please give me a skilling time, give me 1 hour a week for getting into higher skill, the industry is going to blow red. They'll say you are a bloody commie here who's trying to get taken training in this. That's the kind of approach.
Mr. Roy, this particular point actually helps me to take this discussion to the questions from audience, because I have been nudged by my team that we are running against the time. I have a couple of questions that I have from audience, and before we close the session. So first, this is one from an anonymous, okay. Is the scale of transition in India unique to us? How are other countries doing their transitions, and where does India stand in comparison? As Mr. Roy pointed out, Mandvi, you or Shweta would like to take this. He also just talked about the scaling comparison with China. Any of you wants to take this question?
Yeah, I think India is unique in some ways because the degree of employment or the dependency is much higher compared to perhaps the Western and North America, so the North in general. So Europe is obviously the one, you can count them as the leaders in just transition movement. There's a lot of, there's the institutional structures that we're talking about in terms of what needs to be very efficient structures have already been put in Europe for enabling that transition. So starting at an EU level, where they have identified a just transition fund to be tapped into. They have defined schemes for investments from both public and private sector. And the model that they follow is essentially that these cities and townships that have to undertake that, the coal dependent regions have to develop their own plan and then submit it for seeking funding for that plan. And for that development of that plan, they have structures put in place for capacity building. So really, it's partly hand-holding them through the process, because a coal dependent region, forget India, even in Europe, in Germany, might not have that kind of capability to really envision that future. So there is a lot of knowledge exchange platforms created for them to look at, okay, what is this city in Poland doing, or what is that city in Ukraine doing? So they have set up those structures which are supporting this transition, and the conversation has now, they have reached that level of planning, and that implementation will also start taking shape now. So Europe, and then similar kind of planning activities are happening in Canada. South Africa's got some money now to start their process. But I think India's challenge is unique because the kind of informal economy that we see here is really of a much larger scale, because mechanization in past in certain districts was very strongly protested, and a lot of those steps could not be taken up. But it's not true. Again, it will vary from district to district. Like I said, the example of Korba is in front of us, where the dependency is actually not as much as what we had initially thought while going into the city. So, but as far as a citywide planning, if you talk about that, city level dependency or a region level dependency on coal is concerned, even their whole of economy, whole of a small town is dependent on coal. So in that context, there is similarity, but the scale itself is quite different. Shweta, you would like to add to that?
No, I think you covered quite a bit, but my only thing would be that there have been some experiences from the Chinese example, which can be emulated in terms of developing regional protocols. Because, for example, in the Chinese government's case, we had done a convening a little while back, and we had an expert on Chinese energy policy who had kind of been on the panel. And some of the learnings can be easily taken and transferred in terms of how social security nets are created for those communities, what process is done as a stopgap till that new livelihood diversification plan is implemented. Those kind of issues, and even in terms of in doing that research, in doing that data gathering, I think those are things that we have just been so laid back on, that now that we need to take the decisions on transitioning, we're going to find major data gaps. We won't know what impacts are going to be there on the community. We won't even understand necessarily what will be the skilling preferences or the kind of livelihood diversification that they would want at the local level. So since that data itself gap exists, some of these protocols can easily be taken from the Chinese experience, I think. The other element, I think, is also in terms of moving away from policy, but for example, engaging on the communication. Of course, the Chinese government example may not necessarily work because India has an open democracy. China has a different way of enabling policy, right? So it gets decided at the federal, sub-federal level, and then it just goes to action. In the Indian context, we actually have a lot of need for doing that dialogue and co-creation and consensus building, which may not happen. And I think we should be okay with the consensus not being formed, but the process being followed. So I think in the Indian context, learnings from how the Indonesian government, for example, has been planning and getting stakeholder groups together and creating that dialogue, creating forums where people can actually have this conversation on an ongoing basis. We may not get the solution this year or next year, but having that platform becomes quite critical, so that even if not right now, that opportunity exists, say 2-3 years down the line, for that cross learning to happen. And I think those kind of things can definitely be taken from the other country experiences. And India has been unique on almost every paradigm, right? So let's maintain our unique identity even in GT, but maybe focus on what learnings can be taken from other transitions.
Cool. I just have a couple of two quick questions, and I will request anyone who is responding to have very quick answers, because I just have 7 or 8 minutes left in the program. Okay. As we have been talking about framework, mechanisms, everything, our program, our webinar is just a couple of days. Like next week, we have budget and economic survey coming up. In that context, do you think any of you wants to take this up? Do you think that government is doing enough on just transition? This is a question from Kundan, who works with Mongabay. That do you think that the government is doing enough as far as just transition is program is considered? Do you think that there are programs? Do you think there are dialogues happening? Do you think that the government is trying to address these barriers, whether it is skilling, capacity building? Do you think that there is enough movement from the government side, in a nutshell? Mr. Roy?
Yeah, I think the government is fairly committed to transition, but I am absolutely sure it is inadequately prepared for the just transition. And
Shweta?
yeah.
Yeah, please, just finish.
So,
Sorry.
so Mayank, oh, sorry, sir is finishing.
No, go ahead. I'm finished. Yeah.
Okay, no, so I was just saying that I completely agree with him. We're much further along the energy transition path, but we have just started talking about the just transition things. So it's really in the very initial phases of conversation, whether it is even within the civil society. So it's not just within the government, it's even, people have just started. We did this paper on defining just transition, and there's all kinds of things that came up. So that consensus, even within the researchers and thought leaders or whatever, like it's still not there. So yeah, long way to go.
Okay. Now we have the last question from Chetna Singh, who is a research scholar in Delhi University. She says she's asking how COVID has impacted the running of skill development programs in the clean energy sector, especially in context of solar, as practical aspect is difficult to cover in online and virtual trainings. Please suggest the ways to expedite the training programs in these times of pandemic.
Wait for the COVID to get over. Honestly, you can't really have training without actually physically. There's a limit to the online training, and I mean, this is a general. I don't have much experience about what's happening in the renewable energy, but in generally the training that I have been seeing, that people are getting tired of online training, because essentially you can't learn technical skills without actually hands-on approach, and you have to get involved into doing it. So that's just a broader comment.
I understand. Cheta, just to add to that, probably, it's not just the training parts. I think the overall energy sector and the overall renewable energy sector as a whole, the installation, the space, the growth, everything has been impacted by the pandemic. In fact, the whole economy. So it has taken a hit. I think it will take a little time for things to come back on track and start that momentum for the economy to gain that momentum, especially the clean energy sector. It will take time. I'm sorry, we are running out of time and I have got the nudge. So thank you to all the audience, and that was the last question for us for today. I want to thank all the panelists for their quick reply. In fact, I'll be very honest, these remarks are very, very important and crucial for us, because whether it was Shweta talking about the inclusion of gender, whether it was Manvi talking about the implementation execution part, or Mr. Roy talking about how fast the acquisition is happening, but how fair or unfair it could be. You have given us ideas to pursue, and I'm sure as soon as we pursue and we write about this, we'll come back to you and tell us that thank you for this program, because we took the leaf out of this program and wrote about those stories. Thank you so much for all your replies, for your remarks, for joining us today. And before we close, I just want to thank everyone involved, whether from the Mongabay team or from the audience, for their participation. And I hope all the points that you have raised will somehow reach the stakeholders. And I'm sure with people like Shweta from ICC, or Manvi, who's working closely with parliament committees, or Shweta, who's working with the industry bodies, industry groups, I think we can take the message to stakeholders that what exactly are we talking about, or what exactly needs to be addressed. We hope to carry forward these discussions in the webinars to follow. I think that's all for today. I thank everyone for joining us, for your time, patience, and for just bearing with me. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Have a great weekend. I'm grateful to all of you for today. Thank you so much.
Thank Mike.
Thank you, Mike, for having us. Yeah.